I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, on whose land I am privileged to reside, their elders past, present and emerging.
Sometimes when you cross the threshold, there is no easy way back. Or in the words of the great Joni Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got until it's gone.
This presentation looks at the interrelationship between physical and psychological thresholds within a socio-ecological system. What does crossing a threshold mean physically, and how can we use an awareness of their existence to better manage ecosystems? A case study of this interrelationship, and one that has personal meaning to me, is the eutrophication of Canberra's major lakes over the past few decades. The attempts by government and the community to fix this problem, and what this has meant for how people perceive and use lake systems in Canberra. More on this later in the presentation. So what is a threshold? In broad systems theory, thresholds can be seen as the point at which variables within the system and feedbacks, both positive and negative, can change. This is where the system, having crossed a threshold, undergoes a regime shift or becomes something different. In ecological systems, thresholds are responses to disturbance and pressure that lead to a discontinuity in ecosystems. There are examples of these thresholds in systems all around us, but a good way of thinking about thresholds is as dividing lines between the four phases of the adaptive cycle. When a threshold is crossed, the system tips over into a new state. How do we know when we have crossed a threshold? What are the early signs a change is about to take place? In ecosystems, we can see reductions in biodiversity, changes in the composition and prevalence of species, loss or reduction of population connectivity and function. A simple sign of impending social change would be social unrest, like the marches and protests that precede a revolution. The planetary boundaries work of Johan Rockström and Will Steffen, who spent the last part of his life in Canberra, is important in giving us thresholds that can be measured at a global scale and across a longer time frame. Rockström's planetary boundaries identify safe levels across 9 key factors in Earth systems that are impacted by human activities, and measures where we are overshooting our limits. The news is not good, with 6 of the 9 boundaries assessed, now crossed. Kate Raworth takes this idea further in Donut Economics and turns it into a positive force for change by using these boundaries to identify a safe space for humanity to exist within that integrates social systems with ecological systems. In a global context, thinking like Donut Economics gives us a guidebook on how to build sustainable socio-economic systems that are governed by what is environmentally feasible, or to put it simply, to live within our limits. Scaling back down to the example of the Humble Lake used by Walker in our reading, when I was young, the 2 major lakes of Canberra, Lake Burley Griffin and Lake Ginninderra, both human-made lakes with surface and stormwater runoff zones, were safe for children to swim in and well patronised by the community. Then in the 1990s, things started to noticeably change. The water, which had always suffered from turbidity due to wind conditions and the prevalence of bottom-feeding freshwater fish, like carp in the lakes, suddenly had a distinct smell, and people were told by signage through the news and by word of mouth that they shouldn't swim in the lakes. In reality, and in keeping with the idea that the point at which a threshold is crossed is the result of a slow build-up, blue-green algae, a result of nutrient imbalance, had been appearing sporadically in these lakes since the late 1970s. The early 2000s saw particularly intense blue-green algal blooms, and the regime shift of the lake being a place where Canberrans swam to a place where the authorities would monitor and issue regular updates on water safety was entrenched. Contributing factors to these blue-green algal blooms were primarily phosphorus runoff into the lakes from farmland next to the lakes, pollution from human activities, the explosive growth of the carp population, crowding out other species. At a larger scale within the Panarchy, the impact of the changing climate on Canberra's seasons has led to warmer water conditions in these lakes, which are optimal conditions for cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, to thrive. The intervening 20 years have seen reviews, adaptive management plans put in place, regular quantitative water quality monitoring and reporting systems, and work to reduce phosphate levels in the 2 major lakes. These have had reasonable levels of success and have done so by recognising thresholds related to climatic conditions, measured nutrient content, and other quantitative factors. Public awareness of pollution in stormwater and at recreational areas on the lake and the level of runoff from agriculture into the lakes has reduced as adjacent farmland has become less productive. According to most objective monitoring and risk assessment standards, these two lakes are now swimmable, although this can vary depending on seasons and by location. Despite the best efforts of the authorities to inform the community, the perception that the two major lakes are still unsafe to swim in has stuck. In the words of American political strategist Lee Atwater, perception is reality. Something as simple as the scientific term for blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, conjures images of cyanide-filled water for locals. While the lakes are used for water sports and triathlons, the failure to return them to their previous state as a family recreational water zone in the minds of the Canberra community is demonstrative that when a perception or social memory is formed around the new stable state of an ecosystem, that it is hard to erase or change. So while understanding measurable physical thresholds within a system can help us undertake effective environmental management approaches, we need to better understand the psychology of these thresholds if we want to retain the ecosystem service value of places like the Canberra Lakes. We need to be able to integrate hard to quantify ideas, human attitudes, and changes in perception into our understanding of complex adaptive systems to better understand how to preserve their value. Thank you.